The year was 202 BCE, and the fate of the ancient world balanced on the edge of a blade. On the dusty plains near the village of Zama in North Africa, two of history's greatest military minds prepared to clash in what would become the most consequential battle of their age. On one side stood Hannibal Barca, the legendary Carthaginian general who had terrorized Rome for nearly 2 decades. His name whispered in fear from the 7 hills to the furthest provinces. On the other stood Publius Cornelius Scipio, the brilliant young Roman commander who had risen from the ashes of defeat to become Rome's last hope. This was not merely a battle for territory or treasure. This was a collision between 2 civilizations, 2 ways of life, and 2 men whose destinies had been intertwined since their first encounter on the blood-soaked fields of Italy. The winner would shape the course of Western civilization for centuries to come. The loser would watch his empire crumble into dust. To understand the magnitude of this moment, we must journey back to where it all began, to the hatred that sparked a war and the oath that would consume 2 generations. In 241 BCE, a young boy named Hannibal stood before his father in the smoky shadows of a Carthaginian temple.
I swear,
Barca, the great
by the
general who had led
gods,
Carthage's armies in the
to
First
avenge
Punic
our
War,
fallen.
placed his hand on his son's shoulder and made him swear an oath that would echo through history. The words were simple, but their weight was crushing. Never be a friend of Rome. Never forget what they have taken from us. Never stop fighting until they are destroyed. The First Punic War had ended in catastrophe for Carthage. Rome had seized Sicily, demanded crushing tribute payments, and humiliated the once proud maritime empire that had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. But defeat had not broken Hamilcar's spirit. Instead, it had forged it into something harder, something more dangerous. He would rebuild Carthaginian power in the silver-rich lands of Spain, and his son would be the instrument of Rome's destruction. Young Hannibal grew up in the harsh campaigns of the Iberian Peninsula, where every lesson was written in blood and steel. Under his father's watchful eye, he learned the arts of war, strategy, and command. He studied the movements of armies
vast
like
numbers
other children,
will overwhelm
studied
the enemy.
scrolls, and he came to understand that victory belonged not to the strongest, but to the most cunning. When Hamilcar died in battle,
I bestow
his
upon
mantle
you the
passed to
mantle of
Hasdrubal,
command.
I
Hannibal's
accept this
brother-in-law,
honor, my
who
commander,
continued
with
the
all
work of building
humility.
Carthaginian strength in Spain. But when
Carthage!
Hasdrubal was
Forward!
assassinated in 221 BCE, the army turned to the one man they trusted above all others. At just 26 years old, Hannibal Barca became the supreme commander of Carthaginian forces in Spain. The moment Rome had feared for decades was finally at hand. This was no ordinary young general. This was a man forged by hatred, tempered by war, and driven by an oath sworn in blood. He commanded an army of hardened veterans, Spanish warriors, African cavalry, and Gallic mercenaries who had been welded into a weapon of terrifying effectiveness. More importantly, he possessed something that Rome's generals had never encountered before, a mind that could see 3 moves ahead, a tactical genius that would rewrite the rules of warfare. In 219 BCE, Hannibal struck the match that would ignite the Second Punic War. The city of Saguntum, an independent settlement south of the Ebro River, had become a point of contention between Rome and Carthage. Though technically within Carthage's sphere of influence, Rome had formed ties with the city and considered it under their protection. Hannibal saw his opportunity. He laid siege to Saguntum, knowing full well that Rome would view this as an act of war. For 8 months, his forces pounded the city's walls, while Roman envoys hurried back and forth across the Mediterranean, demanding explanations and threatening consequences. When Saguntum finally fell, Rome's ultimatum was clear: surrender Hannibal, or face war. Carthage's answer came not in words, but in the thunder of marching feet. Hannibal had already begun his preparations for the most audacious military campaign the world had ever seen. While Rome expected to fight another naval war in the Mediterranean, or perhaps a land campaign in Spain, Hannibal had conceived something far more ambitious. He would take the war to Rome itself, striking at the very heart of the enemy's power. But first, he would have to cross the Alps. The army that departed Cartagena in the spring of 218 BCE was a sight to behold. Nearly 90,000 men marched in column after column, their weapons glinting in the Spanish sunlight. There were Iberian infantry with their distinctive round shields, African spearmen from the desert kingdoms, Balearic slingers whose accuracy was legendary, and Numidian cavalry whose horses seemed to dance across the battlefield. Most spectacular of all were the 37 war elephants, massive beasts from the forests of North Africa, trained for battle and loaded with supplies. At the head of this host rode Hannibal himself, his dark eyes fixed on the northern horizon where the Alps rose like a wall between him and his destiny. The crossing of the Pyrenees was the first test of the expedition's resolve. Mountain tribes attacked the column repeatedly, rolling boulders down onto the marching soldiers and picking off stragglers with arrows and javelins. Hannibal lost thousands of men in these skirmishes, but he pressed forward relentlessly. He knew that every day of delay gave Rome more time to prepare their defenses, and he could not afford to lose the element of surprise that was central to his strategy. By the time the Carthaginian army reached the Alps in late autumn, winter was already beginning to bite. The mountain passes were treacherous, covered in ice and snow that made footing uncertain for man and beast alike. Local tribes, fearing for their territories, harassed the column constantly. They pushed rocks from cliff tops, attacked supply trains, and melted away into the mist before Hannibal's forces could retaliate. The elephants, magnificent in the warm plains of Africa, struggled desperately in the thin mountain air. Many collapsed from exhaustion or fell into ravines, their trumpeting cries echoing off the peaks as they plummeted to their deaths. For 15 days, Hannibal's army fought its way through the Alpine passes. Men froze to death in their sleep. Horses stumbled on icy paths and broke their legs. Supply wagons tumbled into gorges, taking precious food and equipment with them. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. These were soldiers who had conquered cities and won battles, but the mountains seemed to mock their martial prowess. Some began to whisper that the gods had cursed their expedition, that they should turn back before it was too late. But Hannibal drove them forward through sheer force of will. When the path became too narrow for the elephants, his engineers carved new routes through the rock face. When avalanches blocked their way, his men dug through the snow and ice with their bare hands. When despair threatened to break his army's spirit,
united in purpose,
Hannibal reminded them of the oath they had all sworn,
any
the promise to make Rome pay for generations of humiliation and oppression. When the Carthaginian army finally descended from the Alps into the Po Valley, they were a shadow of their former selves. Of the 90,000 men who had left Spain, fewer than 26,000 remained. Most of the elephants were dead, and those that survived were sick and weakened. The survivors were frostbitten, exhausted, and hungry. By any reasonable measure, the expedition should have ended there, with the remnants of Hannibal's force limping back to Spain or seeking terms with Rome. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The very fact that they had survived the crossing of the Alps transformed these soldiers into something more than human in their own minds and in the eyes of their enemies. They had accomplished the impossible, marching through terrain that no army had ever crossed before. They were no longer just mercenaries and tribal warriors. They were legends in the making, bound together by shared suffering and an unshakable belief in their commander's genius. Rome had prepared for many things, but they had not prepared for this. The Romans had positioned their armies to guard the traditional routes into Italy, expecting Hannibal to arrive by sea or through the coastal passes. Instead, they received reports that seemed impossible to believe. Scouts rode into Roman camps with wild tales of a Carthaginian army emerging from the mountains like ghosts, accompanied by strange beasts that trumpeted like thunder. The Senate dismissed these reports as panic-induced fantasies until the terrible truth became undeniable. Hannibal was in Italy, and he was already moving toward their armies with deadly purpose. The first Roman force to encounter the Carthaginians was commanded by Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of the man who would one day face Hannibal at Zama. At the Ticinus River, the elder Scipio led his cavalry forward to probe the enemy's strength, confident that his disciplined Roman horsemen would make short work of whatever ragged survivors had stumbled down from the Alps. Instead, he found himself facing Numidian cavalry, whose speed and skill surpassed anything he had encountered. The battle was brief and brutal. Scipio himself was wounded and nearly killed, saved only by the desperate courage of his 18-year-old son, who charged into the melee to rescue his fallen father. This young man, Publius Cornelius Scipio the Younger, would carry the memory of that day for the rest of his life. He had looked into Hannibal's eyes across a battlefield and seen something that chilled him to the bone. Not madness or bloodlust, but cold calculation. This was an enemy who fought not with passion but with precision, who saw every move 3 steps ahead, who turned Roman strengths into weaknesses with surgical skill. The lesson burned itself into the young man's mind, and he began to study his enemy with the intensity of a scholar examining sacred texts. The disaster at Ticinus was only the beginning. At the Trebia River, Hannibal laid his first great trap on Italian soil. He lured the Roman consul Tiberius Longus into attacking across an icy river at dawn, when Roman soldiers were cold, wet, and hungry. As the legions struggled through the freezing water, Carthaginian forces struck them from concealed positions on both flanks. The Romans fought with desperate courage, but they were caught in a vice that crushed them methodically. Of the 40,000 Romans who crossed the Trebia that morning, fewer than 10,000 escaped the slaughter. Like Trasimene, Hannibal's genius reached new heights of devastation. He positioned his army in the hills overlooking the lake, hidden by morning mist, and waited for the Roman consul Gaius Flaminius to march his legions along the narrow path beside the water. When the trap was sprung, it was like watching a pack of wolves tear apart sheep. The Romans had no room to maneuver, no way to form their traditional battle lines. They died in their thousands, their bodies floating in the lake's placid waters while Hannibal's soldiers stripped them of armor and weapons. But it was at Cannae that Hannibal achieved his masterpiece, a victory so complete and terrible that it would be studied by military commanders for centuries to come. The Roman consuls Lucius Aemilius
numbers
Paulus
will overwhelm
and Gaius
the enemy.
Terentius Varro had assembled the largest army in Roman history, 87,000 men, arranged in a formation so dense and powerful that it seemed capable of smashing through any defense. They were confident that sheer numbers would overwhelm the Carthaginian upstart who had humiliated their predecessors. Hannibal saw their confidence and turned it into a weapon against them. He arranged his forces in a crescent formation, with his weakest troops in the center and his veteran African infantry hidden on the flanks. As the massive Roman formation charged forward, the Carthaginian center gave ground slowly, drawing the legions deeper into the trap. The Romans pressed harder, sensing victory within their grasp, their ranks bunching together as they pursued what they believed to be a fleeing enemy. Then the jaws of the trap snapped shut. Hannibal's African veterans struck the Roman flanks while his cavalry, having routed their Roman counterparts, charged into the rear of the legions. In the space of a few hours, the flower of Roman manhood was systematically destroyed. 50,000 Romans died that day, including the consul Paulus, dozens of senators, and hundreds of equites. The survivors fled in terror, carrying tales of slaughter so immense that many refused to believe them. Rome itself trembled as news of Cannae spread through the city.
We must
wailed
leave.
in the streets. The Senate met in emergency session, their faces pale with shock
Where do we
and
go?
fear. Some spoke of abandoning the city entirely, of fleeing beyond the Alps where Hannibal could not follow. For the first time in their history, the Romans faced the very real possibility that their republic might not survive. The wolf that had devoured its neighbors was finally confronting a predator more cunning than itself. Yet even in their darkest hour, something within the Roman spirit refused to break. Where other peoples might have sued for peace or fled into exile, the Romans made a decision that would echo through history. They would not surrender. They would not negotiate. They would fight on, no matter the cost, until either Rome or Carthage lay in ruins. The Senate appointed Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator, a man whose strategy would frustrate Hannibal's brilliance through sheer stubborn endurance. Fabius understood what his predecessors had not. Rome could not defeat Hannibal in open battle, not yet. But they could deny him the decisive victory he needed to end the war.
You
They
betray
would avoid
Rome!
major engagements, harass his supply lines, and slowly bleed his army through 1,000 small cuts. It was a strategy that required patience, discipline, and the willingness to endure mockery from those who called Fabius a coward for refusing to fight. The Fabian strategy worked, but at a terrible price. For years, Hannibal ranged across southern Italy like a wolf among sheep, taking cities, destroying crops, and turning Rome's allies against her. The Italian countryside became a wasteland of burned villages and abandoned farms. Trade ground to a halt as merchants feared to travel roads patrolled by Carthaginian cavalry. The Roman treasury, already strained by the costs of war, began to run dangerously low. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tide began to turn. Hannibal's army, cut off from reinforcements and supplies, gradually weakened. His Spanish and Gallic troops, fighting far from their homes, began to desert. The elephants that had survived the Alpine crossing finally succumbed to disease and exhaustion. Most critically, Hannibal found himself trapped in a strategic deadlock. He could win battles, but he could not win the war. Rome's network of allies, though shaken,
the terrain ahead
held firm.
is treacherous.
The city itself remained impregnable behind its walls. Meanwhile,
our path is
in the
clear,
smoking ruins of defeat,
and her resolve
a new generation
unbroken.
of Roman commanders was learning the lessons that would eventually turn the tables on Carthage. At their head was young Scipio, now grown to manhood and hardened by years of war. He had studied Hannibal's tactics with obsessive intensity, analyzing every victory, dissecting every stratagem. Where other Roman generals saw only defeat, Scipio saw opportunity. He began to understand
I will
that
take
Hannibal's
on this
greatest
perilous
strength,
mission
his
for
tactical
Rome.
flexibility, could be turned against him if the Romans were willing to abandon their rigid traditional methods. In 210 BCE, Scipio volunteered for what many considered a suicide mission. He would take command of Roman forces in Spain and attempt to cut off Hannibal's supply lines at their source.
Soldiers,
it was a desperate gamble
Carthage
by a republic
awaits.
running out of options.
Our destiny
But Scipio
is on that
had a vision
shore.
that went far beyond mere survival. He would not simply defend Roman territory. He would carry the war to Carthage itself, forcing them to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend their homeland. The student was ready to face his teacher, and the stage was being set for the final confrontation that would determine the fate of the ancient world. Scipio's Spanish campaign began like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Where seasoned commanders had failed, this young upstart succeeded through audacity that bordered on madness. He struck first at New Carthage, the jewel of Carthaginian Spain, in an assault so swift and unexpected that the city's defenders barely had time to man their walls. Using intelligence gathered from local fishermen about the tides in the harbour lagoon, Scipio led a surprise attack across waters that the Carthaginians believed impassable. His soldiers waded through chest-deep water while the defenders watched in disbelief, and by nightfall the strongest fortress in Spain had fallen to Rome.
We
the
cannot
psychological
trust
impact
Carthage
of
any
New
longer.
Carthage's capture rippled
Perhaps
across
you
the
are right.
peninsula like wildfire.
I have
Spanish tribes who had served Carthage out of fear or necessity began to reconsider their loyalties. Here was a Roman general who fought like Hannibal himself, using speed, deception, and local knowledge to achieve what conventional tactics could not. More importantly, Scipio treated his Spanish prisoners with unexpected mercy, releasing them to return to their tribes with tales of Roman clemency. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy that would pay dividends in the battle to come. Hasdrubal
advance
Barca,
with speed
Hannibal's
and
younger
precision,
brother and commander of
confuse
Carthaginian
their
forces in
ranks.
Spain, found himself facing an enemy unlike any Roman general he had encountered before. Scipio moved his armies with the fluid grace of a dancer, striking where least expected and vanishing before counterattacks could be organized. At Baecula, Hasdrubal attempted to use the high ground to his advantage, positioning his forces on a steep hillside that should have been impregnable to Roman assault. Instead, Scipio divided his army into 3 columns, sending 2 in wide flanking movements, while the third made a diversionary attack up the center. When the trap closed, Hasdrubal barely escaped with a fraction of his original force. The defeat at Baecula forced Hasdrubal into a desperate decision. He would abandon Spain entirely and march to Italy with whatever forces he could salvage, hoping to join his brother Hannibal in a final assault on Rome. It was exactly what Scipio had hoped for. By forcing the Carthaginians to divide their attention between 2 fronts, he had created opportunities that would not have existed otherwise. As Hasdrubal's army disappeared over the Pyrenees, Scipio turned his attention to the remaining Carthaginian forces in Spain. The final blow came at Ilipa, where Scipio faced Hasdrubal Gisco and Mago Barca, the last Carthaginian commanders of any significance in Spain. Here, Scipio demonstrated that he had not merely copied Hannibal's tactics but had improved upon them. He arranged his forces in the same formation he had used for days of preliminary skirmishing, with Roman legions in the center and Spanish allies on the flanks. But on the day of battle, he reversed the positions while his enemies were still forming their lines, placing his veteran Romans on the wings where they could deliver crushing flanking attacks. The Carthaginian army disintegrated under the assault. Soldiers who had fought bravely for years threw down their weapons and fled rather than face the methodical destruction that Scipio's reformed tactics delivered. In a single afternoon, Carthaginian power in Spain was broken forever. The silver mines that had funded Hannibal's war machine fell into Roman hands, along with the recruitment grounds that had supplied fresh troops for nearly 2 decades. Yet Scipio's greatest achievement in Spain was not military, but diplomatic. He had forged an alliance with a young Numidian prince named Massinissa, whose cavalry would prove decisive in the battles to come.
We stand on the precipice of a new era,
but Scipio's combination of respect, generosity, and strategic vision won him over completely. Here was a Roman who understood that victory required more than just defeating enemies in battle. It required building coalitions, inspiring loyalty, and creating lasting relationships with peoples who had never had reason to trust Rome before. As news of Scipio's victories reached Rome,
outmaneuvered
the
Hannibal
political
at
landscape
Zama
began to shift
with a
dramatically.
brilliance that
The young general who had volunteered for a suicide mission was suddenly being hailed as the savior of the Republic. Veterans of his Spanish campaigns returned home with tales of his tactical brilliance and personal courage. More importantly, they brought with them Spanish silver and Carthaginian treasure that helped refill Rome's depleted treasury. For the first time since Cannae, Romans began to believe that
we cannot
might
stand
actually be
idly
possible.
by and wait.
But Scipio's ambitions extended far beyond Spain. While other commanders spoke of containing Hannibal or wearing him down through attrition, Scipio envisioned something far more audacious. He would invade Africa itself, striking at the heart of Carthaginian power and forcing them to recall Hannibal from Italy. It was a strategy that required not just military skill but political courage. For many in the Roman Senate viewed such an expedition as reckless beyond measure. The debate that followed would define the final phase of the war.
We must persist. We risk repeating the mistakes of the past if we divide our forces now.
Argued that Rome should continue the defensive strategy that had prevented total defeat. They pointed out that Hannibal still commanded a dangerous army in
we meet
southern
Hannibal
Italy,
on his own
and that
soil.
dividing Roman forces between 2 fronts was precisely the kind of mistake that had led to previous disasters. Why take such enormous risks when time seemed to be on Rome's side? Scipio's response revealed the strategic vision that set him apart from his contemporaries. He understood that time was not necessarily Rome's ally. Every year the war continued, drained the Republic's resources, and tested the loyalty of its allies. Hannibal might be contained for now, but he remained a constant threat, a wolf prowling at the edges of the fold. Moreover, Carthage was using the stalemate in Italy to rebuild its strength elsewhere, forging new alliances and gathering fresh resources. The only way to end the war decisively was to force Carthage to fight on Rome's terms, in a place and time of Roman choosing. The political battle was as intense as any military engagement. Scipio used every weapon in his arsenal, from personal charisma to carefully orchestrated public demonstrations of divine favor.
Citizens of
the
Rome,
gods themselves
I bring you
had blessed
not
his
just
mission,
victory,
staging
but a
elaborate
divine
ceremonies
promise
at
of
temples
renewed
where he
hope
communed
and
with
an
Jupiter
unbreakable
and
spirit.
received prophetic visions. Whether he truly believed in these supernatural endorsements or simply understood their political value, the effect was electric. The Roman
We
people,
grant the expedition,
desperate for hope
but
after
with
years
strict
of
conditions
grinding
to
warfare,
ensure our
embraced
interests
Scipio
are
as their
upheld.
champion. When the Senate finally authorized the African expedition, it came with conditions that revealed the depth of opposition Scipio still faced. He would receive no additional legions from Rome's stretched resources. Instead, he would have to make do with volunteers and the troops already under his command in Sicily. It was a compromise that satisfied neither his supporters nor his opponents, but it gave Scipio the authorization he needed to proceed. The army that assembled in Sicily during the winter of 205 to 204 BCE was unlike any Roman force that had ever taken the field. At its core were the veterans of the Spanish campaigns, hardened soldiers who had learned to fight with Hannibalic flexibility while maintaining Roman discipline. They were joined by volunteers from across Italy, men who had lost families and fortunes to Carthaginian raids and now sought revenge. Most crucially, Scipio had secured the promise of Numidian cavalry support from Massinissa, whose horsemen would give him the mobility advantage that Roman armies had so often lacked. And so, on that fateful October day in 202 BCE, the greatest military minds of their age finally met in battle. When the dust settled over Zama's plains, it was Scipio who stood victorious, his tactical brilliance having finally matched and surpassed his legendary opponent. Hannibal's defeat marked not just the end of the Second Punic War, but the dawn of Roman dominance that would reshape the ancient world for centuries to come.